Good evening. Tonight is Thursday night, December 26, 2024. Welcome to Mining the Riches of the Parsha. I am so grateful to every one of you for setting aside time so that we can study together. I've been looking forward to this all week, and I'm just very, very grateful to be able to share this time with you. MiKeitz yamim, and it was at the end of 2 years. Uparo cholem, and Paro had a dream. That's the beginning of this week's Torah portion, the Parsha MiKeitz. So Paro had a dream. He was standing by the Nile. Okay, he doesn't know the interpretation of it. And then someone speaks up, and Yosef is the one who interprets the dream. Okay, the whole story, the whole Parsha that we know. What are the first words? MiKeitz yamim, and it was at the end of 2 years. What 2 years are we talking about? The end of which 2 years? Why 2 years? So, at the end of last week's Torah portion, Vayeshev, we learned that Yosef had been sold as a servant in Egypt, and he had been falsely accused of a crime, and he was put in prison. And Rashi says that Yosef was only supposed to be in prison for 10 years. I say only. 10 years is quite a long time to be in prison, especially for someone who's been falsely accused. But he was only supposed to be in prison for 10 years. However, at the end of last week's Torah portion, remember, there were 2 people in the prison with him that had dreams, the wine steward and the baker to Paro. And they both had a dream. And Yosef interpreted their dreams, and Yosef's interpretation came true, and the wine steward was returned to his position. And Yosef said to him, "Please, remember me when you get back to Paro. Do me a favor. When you get back to Paro, please speak on my behalf. I was falsely accused. I don't deserve to be here. So please, I've given you this interpretation of your dream, which has come true. You're being released. So please remember me." Rashi says that our sages tell us that Yosef was punished for a lapse in faith. He should have relied on God, that God would release him in the right time. And instead, he had a lapse in his faith that God would take care of him. And he put reliance in this human being, this person, to ask him to intercede that he should be released sooner. And that is seen as a fault of Yosef. And because of that fault, Yosef was in prison an additional 2 years. That's what it means in our Torah portion. MiKeitz yamim. It was at the end of 2 years, meaning it was at the end of the extra 2 years that were added on to his sentence as a punishment for his lack of faith in God. Now, I must tell you that interpretation of Rashi is very difficult for me to understand, because we have a central principle of hishtadlus. A person should try to use their own efforts to achieve the goals that they want, not just to rely on God to perform a miracle. So what was wrong with asking what lack of faith is there to ask the person who's going to be going back to his position and will be seeing Paro to ask him to remember? It doesn't seem to me like a lack of faith. Okay, that's a subject for another time. But in any event, that's what Rashi says. It was the end of 2 years, added to his sentence because of a lack of faith. All right. That's what Rashi says. But others disagree. Rabbeinu Avram ben Harambam, the son of Maimonides, says that these 2 years that he was in prison longer than originally it was supposed to be, it was not a punishment. It was a blessing. How in the world can it be a blessing to have 2 years added to his sentence? One of our important medieval commentators, Rabbi Yonah, writes, "One who truly trusts in God should hope in the midst of their distress that the darkness will not be the cause of their light." In other words, as our sages explain, if I did not fall, I could not have arisen. If I had not been in the darkness, it would not have been light for me. In other words, Rabbi Yonah is trying to explain that if Nebuch, a person, is going through a difficulty, they should try to see. I mean, it can be very, very difficult, very hard, very challenging, of course, but they should try to see that the difficulty they're facing is not a descent, but it's actually a preparation for an ascent. And Rav Nachman of Bratslav explains this as follows. When God has the intention that a person should have an ascension, should go to a higher place, spiritually, materially, whatever the layer is. But when God intends that a person should ascend, they must first undergo a descent. So that the descent, the darkness, the difficulty, is for the purpose of the light, the ascent. And what that means practically, and it is a very big challenge, and each of us goes through this in our own lives, and of course we, the Jewish people, are going through this now. When there is a descent in our lives, when there is a darkness, we should try to remember that this is a stage in the unfolding process that leads to ascending. In other words, God says to us, trust me. When we are in the prisons of our lives, and of course, we keep in mind every day those of our brothers and sisters who literally are in prison captives, but in less dramatic terms, so many of us who are going through our own personal prison, our own personal darkness, we're not simply being punished with more time in prison, God says to us. God says, look harder for me. Look harder to find how I am going to help you to grow as a result of this. And so Rabbi Avram ben Harambam says that these extra 2 years that Yosef spent in prison were not a punishment. In other words, Yosef's redemption was only possible because of this delay. Because, explain it as follows. Let's say the wine steward had left the prison, he went back to Paro, and he said something to Paro about Yosef. And Paro was moved, and what would Paro have done? If the wine steward would have done as Yosef requested, what might first of all, Paro could have done nothing. What do I care about a Jew in prison? Or at best, Paro maybe would have pardoned Yosef and let him go free. But there would not have been any reason for any kind of face-to-face meeting. Yosef and Paro would never have met. There would be no opportunity for Yosef to make any kind of impression on Paro. Instead, what happened, because there was a 2-year delay, the wine steward forgot about Yosef. And it would appear that God also forgot about Yosef. But that's not the way to look at it. The way to look at it is that 2 years later, that's when Paro dreamed his dreams. And that's when the wine steward suddenly remembered Yosef. It triggered his memory because Yosef had interpreted his dreams, and now Paro has dreams, and there's no one who can interpret the dreams for Paro. So that meant that now, by the wine steward remembering Yosef specifically at this moment, yes, Yosef would have preferred to remember it 2 years ago, so he would have been free. But let's understand what's happening. Because the wine steward remembers it at exactly this moment, Yosef gets to stand before Paro and personally impress the ruler of the most important country of the world, the most powerful country in the world at that time, and to become second in command. And ultimately to be able not only to feed the people of Egypt through a terrible famine, but his own family, and to reunite his family, as we're going to see in the Torah portions that follow. In other words, if we look at this on a cursory level, the story of Yosef, and the same thing is true if we look at our own lives, and certainly true if we look at the lives of Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, since last October 7th. On a cursory level, the narrative we see is God abandoning us, rejecting us when we need God's assistance most. That's what we see on the surface. But when we try to look a bit harder, and we have discussed this many times over the course of this past year, and we will continue to do so, if we try to look a bit harder, we may be able to see, not always, and not right away, but we may be able to see eventually that God has not forgotten us in prison. God is placing us in the darkness as the first stage of our ascent, which is to follow. And when does Yosef see this? When does Yosef realize that it was imperative that he remain in prison for those 2 years? At the moment that Yosef hears Paro's dreams. Yosef hears Paro's dreams. Remember, there are 7 fat cows, there are 7 skinny cows, and then there's another dream, there are 7 fat stalks of grain and 7 blighted stalks of grain, and Yosef tells Paro about the 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And then Yosef says the most curious thing. It's quite amazing. Yosef says, after giving this interpretation, V'ata yera Paro ish navon v'chacham, v'shiseo al eretz Mitzrayim. Now, Paro, that I've told you this interpretation, you should appoint a very, very smart person to oversee what needs to be done. And that means for there to be a collection so that everyone is contributing to a general fund to save up so that there's a gigantic storage of extra grain. And then when the time of the famine comes, you'll be able to release it to people as needed for them to be able to survive. Vayitav hadavar b'nei Paro u'b'nei kol avadav. This advice found favor in Paro's eyes and in the eyes of his advisors. Vayomer Paro avodav, and Paro said to his servants, his ministers, his advisors, Hanimtza kazeh ish asher ruach elakim bo? Could we find a person who is as qualified to oversee this gigantic project? Could we find a person as qualified as this one, Yosef? Vayomer Paro al Yosef, Paro says to Yosef, Acharei hodia elakim oscha es kol zos, ein navon v'chacham kamocha. Once God has given you this interpretation to tell me the meaning of the dreams, there is no one who could do this job as well as you could. Atatiya al Besi, you will now be second in command of the entire country. Val picha yishak kol ami, and the entire country will be fed, will be supported, taken care of through you. Rak hakisi agdel mimecha. Only I will be higher than you. You'll be second in command. Now, it seems ridiculous because what in Yosef's life qualifies him to be the master over all of Egypt's food and second in command of the leading world power? Until the age of 17, Yosef was a privileged, coddled young man. Then he was a slave. And then he was a prisoner. That's his entire life experience. And you should know that until today, professional economists debate the merit of this advice that Yosef gave to Paro. Is it the right way to do it economically? Is it not the right way? Could there have been a better way? What gave Yosef the crazy idea that he could come up with a plan to save the people of Egypt and the entire world, and to be the one to execute this plan? So here's the key. What gave Yosef this confidence, this sense of mission? It could not have happened 2 years earlier. It was Yosef hearing Paro's dreams and realizing that they were not only Paro's dreams, they were Yosef's dreams from when he was 17 years old, back at the beginning of last week's Torah portion. At the beginning of the Torah portion by Yeshev, Yosef had a dream. And the similarities between Yosef's dream and Paro's dream are not a coincidence. Bailey Newman points this out. Paro dreamt of grain, and Yosef dreamt of grain. Yosef, in last week's Torah portion, had a dream as a 17-year-old boy. And at the root of that dream, if you remember, is about power through food. Right? All the brothers would bow down to him because he would provide the food. And now, after these 2 years, Yosef is being presented with the opportunity to enact both his own dream and Paro's dream at the same time. And that's why he knew that he had to take this risk. He was being entrusted with a mission from God, and he had to be in that prison for those 2 extra years, because otherwise he would not have seen it. He would not have made the connection. He would not have had the opportunity that God and Paro gave him. But he was, and he did. Yosef teaches us that the purpose of life is to embrace uncertainty and challenge. Because the purpose of life is for us to grow from those experiences and to find our mission from those experiences. Every one of us faces this test individually and at times like now collectively. I want to make it clear, though, I do not mean to suggest in any way that somehow there is some kind of positive element or benefit, nebuch, to the hostages in Gaza being held there. No. I want to be very clear. We pray and we advocate that they should be released now, no delay. Their lives are in danger. This is not a situation that I'm discussing, but I'm talking about other kinds of darkness that we experience in life. And for those other kinds of darkness and challenge, our Torah portion holds the key to navigating the roiling waters that all of us experience from time to time. when we come to the synagogue, when we come to shul, we say the prayers. Even if we're not in shul, and we're praying at home, we say the same prayers, except there are certain prayers that we're only allowed to say if we are in the presence of a minyan. If there's a minyan of 10 Jewish adult men, then that allows certain prayers which are called dvarim shebikdusha, prayers of holiness, that can only be recited in the presence of a minyan. That means that every man, woman, and child has a benefit and opportunity when praying with the minyan to be able to add those prayers of holiness to their prayers. The fact that these specific prayers, like the Kaddish, like reading from the Torah, like saying Baruch Hu, like the Kedusha, the reader's repetition, the fact that these specific prayers require a minyan is derived from the verse, V'nikdashti b'soch b'nei Yisrael. I will be sanctified in the midst of the children of Israel. Okay, so if God is in the midst of the children of Israel, then there's greater sanctification, and there are certain prayers that can then be recited because there's a minyan. How do we come up with the number 10? Why 10? Why not 9? Why not 11? Why not 13? So we've discussed this before, and I've shared with you the answer given in the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, which says that we derive the number 10 from a very curious source, from the Meraglim, the spies. Remember, Jewish people traveling through the desert, about to go into Israel. They come up with a plan to send spies to spy out the land. They send 12 spies. 2 of the spies come back with a positive report, but 10 of the spies come back with a negative report. It's not so good. We're not going to be able to do it. They're too strong for us. And because of that, God is very upset and causes the Jewish people to have to wander for 40 years in the desert before entering Israel. There were 12 spies, but 2 of them gave a positive report. 10 gave a negative report. Says the Talmud, that's the source of 10 for a minyan. It's a very curious source. And we discussed this before. Obviously, a minyan is not comprised of 10 righteous people. It could be, but a minyan can also be comprised of 10 Jewish adult men who are not so righteous. And we've discussed before this concept that when we pray to God as a group, as a community, we have to include every part of the group. Those people we look up to and those people who we do not yet look up to. Everyone is part of the group. Okay. That's the opinion of the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. The Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, says something different. The Jerusalem Talmud says that the source of 10 for a minyan is in this week's Torah portion, when the 10 sons of Jacob come into Egypt, and they're coming to buy grain because it's the years of famine. The 10 sons of Jacob came into Egypt, besoch haba'im, among the arrivals into Egypt, coming to buy food. So since the Torah says that these 10 sons came besoch haba'im, in the midst of the arrivals, and besoch is like this other verse, v'nikdashti besoch b'nei Yisrael, so 10 is the number for a minyan. It's a strange derivation. It gets even stranger when Rashi tells us the comment of our rabbis that the 10 brothers, when they came to Egypt, they each entered from a different gate. They didn't come together as a group. They split up. Each one came in from a different gate. Why did they come in different gates? Well, Rashi says that their father Yaakov had instructed them to do so. Jacob said, when you get to Egypt to buy food, don't enter through the same gate because you'll arouse suspicion. 10 people traveling as a group. What are they here for? What plans do they have? And in fact, Yaakov is right to be worried because later Yosef does say, are you spies? Is that why you've come? So Yaakov says, go through 10 gates so you will not arouse any suspicion. But there's another opinion. And the other opinion is that the brothers came up with this plan on their own. They said, listen, we're here to buy grain. But you know what? We also want to find our brother Yosef because they remember what had happened and where he was. And once we're going there, we're going to try to find him. And the best way to find somebody in a big city where you don't know where they are, if you have 10 people, split up. Everybody searches another area. So they entered in through separate gates in order to expand their search for Yosef. Rabbi Yochanan Zweig explains as follows. When we come to shul and pray with the Minyan, it's not just a group of people who happen to be saying the same prayer at the same time. Praying in a synagogue with a Minyan means there is a collective meeting of the minds. That everyone in the shul is united for a common purpose, a common cause. In the case of prayer, to be able to approach God as a community. If the reason that the brothers went in through separate gates was so that they would not be seen together, that would not be a source of a number for a minyan because there's no cohesion. There's no unity. Each person's coming through a separate gate. However, if the brothers decided that the reason we're going to enter 10 different gates is so that we will be able more efficiently to follow the goal that we are all seeking, which in that case was to find Yosef. In other words, there was a common purpose. There was a working together cohesively for a specific goal. And therefore, the number 10 would be a number that makes sense to require for a minyan. And let's keep in mind the context, because these 10 men, right, these sons of Yaakov, the brothers of Yosef, they knew they had done something very wrong. And they were trying to fix it. They were trying to improve themselves. They were trying to undo some of the harm that they had caused, which makes it a very fitting context for what creates a minyan within prayer, because that's what we're all trying to do. We're trying to improve ourselves. We're trying to improve our connection to God. We're trying to fix the shortcomings that we have. According to the Talmud Yerushalmi, it makes perfect sense why this should be the source of a minyan comprising of 10 people. And when we attend shul, we need to realize and recognize and appreciate we're not just sitting in a room with others. We are achieving a meeting of the minds. We are transforming ourselves. We are connecting with each other for a common purpose. In this case, in order to connect with God through prayer. And it is when we join like that that we achieve this higher level of holiness. Not just sitting in the same room, saying the words on the same page, but when we actively feel that we are connected to each other in saying these prayers, that's when we achieve this higher level of holiness. And we are deserving of saying those special prayers that fulfills the words, V'nikdashti b'soch b'nei Yisrael. God says, I will be sanctified in the midst of the Jewish people. Tonight is the beginning of the second night of Chanukah. Happy Chanukah. On Chanukah, we add a prayer to the Amidah and to the benching, the Birkat HaMazon. And there are two paragraphs. The first paragraph starts with the words Al Anisim. We thank God for the miracle that leads to the holiday of Chanukah. And then the second paragraph is a brief description of the Chanukah story. And it's the same for Purim. On Purim, we have the same, the first paragraph is the same. We thank God for the miracle that led to the holiday of Purim. And then we have a short paragraph that describes the events that lead up to Purim. And that paragraph for Purim begins with the words, Bimei Mordechai ve'Esther. In the days of Mordechai and Esther, and this happened, and that happened, and that happened, and Haman was killed and hung on a tree. Now, when the prayer says, Bimei Mordechai ve'Esther, in the days of Mordechai and Esther, clearly it does not only locate the Purim story in time. We know when Mordechai and Esther lived, so we know when the Purim story takes place. But it also tells us the names of the two main characters, Mordechai and Esther, who are central to the story. So we know two things just from the first words, Bimei Mordechai ve'Esther, in the days of Mordechai and Esther. We know, number one, when it happened, and we know who are the central figures in this story, Mordechai and Esther. That's Purim. For Chanukah, we have a corresponding paragraph that talks about Chanukah. And that starts with these words. Bimei Matityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol. In the days of Matityahu, the son of Yochanan, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. Okay. So, we know that the second temple, the second Beit HaMikdash, stood for about 400 years. We know that the Chanukah story, Matityahu, was approximately halfway through. The events directly relating to Chanukah occur at about the year 165 before the Common Era, so it's approximately halfway through. Okay, so Bimei Matityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol, we locate the story in time, about 165 before the Common Era. And we also mention a central character, Matityahu. Matityahu had sons, the Maccabees, Yehuda Maccabee and Yonasan and Shimon and the other sons. Matityahu was the patriarch of this family. So we know the main character. But what's strange is, why do we mention the father of Matityahu? Yochanan Kohen Gadol. Yochanan the high priest. In Purim, we say Mordechai and Esther. We don't mention Mordechai's father. We don't mention Esther's father. Just Mordechai and Esther. Here, we mention Matityahu. Why not just leave it Matityahu like Mordechai and Esther? Why do we have to mention Matityahu, the son of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, Yochanan the high priest? So the first thing I want to say, and this is based on an essay by Rabbi Chaim Jachter, the first thing I want to say is that there is dispute among the commentaries. Who is this Yochanan Kohen Gadol? Who is this high priest named Yochanan? There was more than one high priest with the same name. But there is a Yochanan Kohen Gadol who is mentioned several times in the Talmud. And there is evidence to support that the Yochanan Kohen Gadol that we're talking about in the Chanukah story is the same one who's mentioned several times in the Talmud. So although this is a dispute, let's just assume that this is the case. For the sake of our discussion tonight, let's assume that Matityahu is the son of Yochanan, the high priest, who is mentioned several times in the Talmud. Now, I mentioned this morning. After the Chanukah story, later, there was a monarchy. It was short-lived, a Hashmonaim, the monarchy of the Hashmonaim. It was short-lived. It started later, after the Purim story. Okay, after the Chanukah story. But before that, in the first half of the Second Temple period, there was no monarchy. And the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, was the highest leader in Israel. And the Talmud tells us about this particular Kohen Gadol, Yochanan Kohen Gadol. The Talmud tells us there were 5 pieces of legislation, important legislation, that Yochanan legislated. That is, he was not only a priest, a high priest, he was also a legislator. And although these are bold and creative pieces of legislation, I'm not going to go through the details of all of them now, but his rulings were accepted, which attests to his authority, that his rulings were accepted, even though they were novel and creative. So, Rabbi Jacta says it's not so surprising that Yochanan Kohen Gadol should have a son whose name is Matityahu, who turns out to be a revolutionary, who's very, very bold, who starts a movement to be able to get rid of pagan practices and bring back an authentic vision of Judaism that was lacking at that time, because Matityahu learned this from his father. It's not surprising. However, the trouble begins when we learn the passage in the Talmud. It's a horrifying passage in the Talmud. It's a Masechta Brachos. The Talmud says about Yochanan Kohen Gadol, Yochanan, this high priest, he served as Kohen Gadol, the highest religious leader, the highest leader in Israel for 80 years. And after serving as a Kohen Gadol for 80 years, he lost his faith in God. He became a tzadduki. He became a heretic. How is it possible? How is it possible that a person who's not just a religious Jew, but the leading religious Jew, the leader of the spiritual leader of the Jewish people, and he's in his position for 80 years, and after 80 years, he denies God's existence, he denies God's involvement in the world? How does that happen? And number 2, given that this Yochanan came to such a disastrous end at the end of his life, why should we be mentioning him in the story about Chanukah? Why do we mention his name at all? Just say Matityahu. This didn't happen to Matityahu. Matityahu. We don't have to mention his father. Why mention his father if he's a person who came to such an ignominious end? I want to tell you a story. I heard this story from Rabbi Joel Grossman. When he was a teenager, he lived in Monsey, New York, and Rav Moshe Feinstein and Mrs. Feinstein would sometimes come to visit because they had a daughter and son-in-law who lived in Monsey, and they would come to visit in Monsey. Rav Moshe Feinstein was the greatest authority in Jewish law in his time. He died in the 1980s. And as a boy, this Joel Grossman would help Rav Moshe when he came to visit Muncie, would drive him, would take him in and escort him. And as a boy, Joel Grossman sees that Rav Moshe Feinstein, every single minute he was studying Torah. If he was driving in the car, he would open a book. And if he was waiting in line, he would open a Talmud. Not a minute went by. And this is the greatest scholar in Jewish law in the entire world. So this boy, Joel Grossman, says to him, Rebbe, at that time he was in his late 80s, said to him, you know the Talmud by heart. You know the entire Torah. Why do you have to keep studying the Torah so much? You know it already. And Rav Moshe said to him, it's absolutely stunning. Rav Moshe said to him, if Yochanan Kohen Gadol could become a heretic after 80 years of serving as the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, Moshe Feinstein can also become a heretic. What Rabbi Feinstein is teaching us is that this shocking conclusion to Yochanan Kohen Gadol's life is to teach us that we have to always be in a mindset of growth, of spiritual growth. Because the only alternative to spiritual growth is descent into spiritual abyss. There's no such thing as staying on the same level. You're either going up or you're going down. And in fact, this lesson is expressed during Chanukah, where each night of Chanukah we add an additional light. First night, 1 light. Second night, 2 lights. Tomorrow night, 3 lights. And the Talmud explains this is the opinion of Beis Hillel, and it's based on this principle: Malim bakodesh v'lo maridin. We increase our holiness. We don't decrease. We start with 1, then we go to 2, then we go to 3. We're always increasing. So Yochanan Kohen Gadol is essential to how we light the Chanukah menorah. We light one light on the first night, and then we add, and we add, and we add, in order not to turn out like Yochanan Kohen Gadol. It is essential that we mention his name in this paragraph about this holiday, because the essence of the holiday of Chanukah is about the need to continually grow in our spirituality, to learn more Torah, to do more mitzvos, to be more considerate of other people. Not to stay the same, because if we stay the same, we're falling. And it's because the essence of this holiday is based on this principle of Malim Bakodesh. Each day we have to do a little bit more. We have to grow a little bit more. We have to get a little bit higher. Because that's the essence of this holiday. We have to remember what happened to Yochanan Kohen Gadol. And that's why we mention his name. And this lesson does not apply only to Chanukah. It applies all year long. There's no such thing as stasis. There's no such thing as staying the same. We're either rising or, God forbid, the opposite. And when we say this prayer, when we mention Matityahu and then his father, Ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol, and we remember what happened to him, and we see as tonight we lit 2 nights, and tomorrow night we're going to light 3, and then 4, and then 5, and then finally 8, we have to remember that this must be the pattern to our spiritual lives until the very last breath we take. My friends, I wish you a beautiful evening, a great Shabbos, and a very happy Chanukah. And I look forward to seeing you soon in person.